Welcome to the spine-tingling world of our unholy tales, where fear takes its darkest form and every shadow holds a chilling secret. We are your guides through the twisted and nightmarish tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat, clutching your pillow for dear life. Get ready to embark on a journey into the abyss of your deepest fears as we explore the realms of the supernatural, the macabre, and the unknown. New Orleans, 1776. Jonathan stood in Congo Square as the slaves danced, their movements frenzied as they called forth their gods. He kept to the shadows, away from the revellers and guards. He cared not for their rituals, but for the one who would soon appear to make good on a bargain struck 50 years past. Jonathan approached, unafraid. "I have what you asked for," he said, holding out the bundle in his arms. Inside, a newborn baby girl whimpered. Baron Samedi took the child, peering into its scrunched face. His mouth split into a grinning rictus. "Our bargain is complete, old friend," the Baron rasped, his gravelly voice like a tomb opening. "I bestow upon you 50 more years of life." He placed a bony hand on Jonathan's chest. Ice spread through his veins, his heart stuttering in his chest. Jonathan gasped at the agony of it, but did not cry out. After a moment, the Baron released him. Jonathan fell to his knees, clutching his chest as warmth and life flowed back into his ancient body. 50 more years of stolen youth and vitality. Around him, the drums beat faster, the dancers oblivious to the unholy transaction taking place. Baron Samedi faded back into billowing smoke amidst raucous laughter. As Jonathan rose, the weight of his next sacrifice pressed upon him. In 50 years' time, the bargain would come due again. New Orleans, 1826. The city was flush in preparation for the upcoming Mardi Gras celebrations. Jonathan kept to the back alleys as he made his way towards Congo Square. He avoided the raucous crowds of revellers, thinking only of his task ahead. In one arm he held a wriggling bundle, freshly plucked from a household on Rampart Street. The child squalled, unhappy with being taken from its mother, but it did not matter. Jonathan had a bargain to keep. As he stepped into the square, a hush fell across the assembled slaves. They knew why he had come. Eyes downcast, they shuffled aside, allowing him to pass and take his place at the centre. Jonathan placed the baby on the ground as the drums began their ominous beat. The dancers gyrated around him, their movements growing more frantic. Shadows lengthened as torches guttered in a sudden chill wind. Then the Baron was there, called forth by offerings of blood and flesh. He tipped his hat at Jonathan in greeting. Behind him, his demon hog snuffled along the ground, searching for the promised sacrifice. "One cried out for you," Jonathan said, indicating the child. It whimpered, feet kicking helplessly in the dirt. "I bring this newborn as offering to renew our pact." "Well done," said the Baron, skeletal face grinning. He took up the baby, peering into its face with hollow sockets. Then he turned to Jonathan, laying one cold hand upon his chest. Jonathan bore the agony, feeling his life prolong again. The Baron laughed with twisted delight as he faded away, child in hand. Around Jonathan the drums celebrated, dancers caught in religious fervour. As his vitality returned, Jonathan closed his eyes. In 50 years he would be back. New Orleans, 1876. Gunshots cracked through the square. Jonathan kept his head down amidst the chaos that had overtaken the city. Reconstruction had brought anger and violence after a brutal war. But tonight racial tensions did not matter. He was here to see the Baron again. The dancers still gyrated by torchlight, despite the violence taking place around Congo Square. They dared not incur the wrath of Baron Samedi by failing to call him forth. So they danced on, eyes wide with terror, even as they summoned the death lower. Jonathan waited, bundle in arms. He had crept into Freedman Town earlier, taking the baby boy from a church orphanage. Outside the square, fires burned as white supremacists and police exchanged gunfire with mixed-race revolutionaries. But the sacrifice would go on. The drums drowned the gunfire. Then, in an explosion of grave dirt and smoke, the Baron emerged. His demon hog, now almost feral from a 50-year absence, snarled and snapped behind him. "The streets run red tonight," the Baron mused. "You chose a good time to call me forth." He threw back his head in rasping laughter. Behind Jonathan, a stray bullet struck one of the dancers. She crumpled without even a whimper. The other dancers stepped over her body and continued their ritual motions. Jonathan strode forward, holding out the baby. "I bring new life for the pact," he said. Around the square, shadows grew long and strange. The Baron took the infant, peering into its face. The hog snuffled after it, red eyes gleaming with hunger. At last, the Baron lowered the child and placed one skeletal hand on Jonathan's chest. The anguish was as intense as he remembered. Jonathan fell to his knees as the Baron fed. But after a moment the pain receded as the lower vanished, his awful laughter echoing over the drums. The dancing continued amidst the chaos of the square. Jonathan watched them, the weight of the next 50 years heavy upon his soul. New Orleans, 1926. Jazz spilled from the radios and open doorways of speakeasies and juke joints. It was the height of the roaring 20s, and New Orleans was alive with music and money, much of it from illegal booze. Jonathan slid through the colourful crowds populating Basin Street, baby in arms. Though prohibition reigned, the party continued unabated in the Big Easy. However, Jonathan cared little for the jazz, the gin, or the flappers. He kept to the shadows as he made his way towards Congo Square. There was but one revelry that concerned him tonight. It proved more difficult than in years past, but he managed to steal into a side balcony of the Myrtle Banks Creole Club unseen. Below, the dancers were already underway, swept up in the frenetic jazz that pounded in time with the drums. They danced the rituals like their ancestors before them, calling forth Baron Samedi. As Jonathan watched, the room turned unnaturally cold. The fires in the wall sconces suddenly flared purple. Then, in an explosion of fetid air and grave dust, the Baron manifested centre stage. Dancers screamed, then prostrated themselves before his gruesome visage. Behind the Baron, his demon hog tore into the remains left from previous ceremonies, hunger never quite slated. The band faltered, but continued their relentless rhythms, too afraid to stop playing for the death lower. Baron Samedi's hollow eyes gleamed as he scanned the room. Then he looked directly at Jonathan's balcony hiding spot and grinned, beckoning. Taking that as his cue, Jonathan crept down a side staircase and entered the throng. Closer now, he could smell the lower, decay and dirt and death. Fear surged inside him, but his feet carried him forward until he stood before Baron Samedi. Wordlessly he held out the child. It mewled pathetically in his hands. Behind him dancers shook and sobbed, yet kept their hypnotic movements in obedience of ancient traditions. "Ah, right on schedule," rasped the Baron, taking the baby. It squirmed helplessly in his grip. "Our little song and dance continues." He cackled, then laid his free hand upon Jonathan's chest. Excruciating cold fountained through him as the Baron drained years of life for his own. Jonathan collapsed, shuddering as the unholy pact renewed. Around him, the music pounded ever faster, celebrating the Baron's terrible glory. At last, Jonathan felt warmth and strength return to his limbs. Gasping, he looked up to find the Baron gone like a grave wind, leaving only a cruel laugh hanging in the air. New Orleans, 1976. Funk music drifted from bars on Frenchman Street, but deeper in the city, another rhythm held sway. In Congo Square, the drums pounded, dancers already working themselves into religious frenzy despite the chill November night. Jonathan kept to the darker side streets as he approached, bundle held tight in his arms. The 60s and 70s had wrought great change, but some old traditions died hard, or refused to die at all. He thought of the past 50 years as he walked: the Depression, World War II, Kennedy, the Civil Rights Movement. Turbulent times leaving death and upheaval in their wake. Perhaps that unrest had strengthened the Baron, fed the darker spiritual undercurrents still flowing beneath this modern age. The music grew louder as Jonathan entered the square. Blighted buildings loomed all around, leaves skittering across cracked pavement. But here the dancers carried on traditions 2 centuries old or more, oblivious to urban decay. They had come to serve the Baron tonight, as had Jonathan. He joined the gathering, baby held close. Then a crackling explosion announced the Baron's arrival. He emerged from the void amidst screams from those unaccustomed to his terrifying visage. Behind him, the hog snarled, more savage than ever after its 50-year absence. Baron Samedi grinned at Jonathan, beckoning him forth. The other celebrants made way, some fleeing outright. The lower's power over death and madness roiled from him, spurring primal terror in all present. With the dancers watching nervously, Jonathan strode forward and presented the child. It mewled, squirming feebly against the inevitable. Baron Samedi took it into one gnarled hand, studying it with interest. "Another life for mine, old friend," he rasped approvingly. Behind him his mount pawed the earth, snuffing after the infant hungrily. Jonathan merely nodded. After so long, what was there to say? He had bound himself to this terrible cycle and had no choice but to see it through until his end. With a rattling laugh, the Baron placed his free hand upon Jonathan's chest, stealing away more of the life force he had first given 2 centuries ago. Cold fountained through Jonathan's veins as he sank to his knees with a gasp. The drums pounded faster, celebrating the pact's renewal. Around them the square seemed to grow darker, the night pulsing with corrupt energies streaming forth from lower and mortal alike. At last it was done. Jonathan knelt, drawing breath again as the Baron withdrew. His gleaming eyes held a promise. In 50 years' time they would come full circle once more. Then, with a rush of laughter, he faded away between one drum beat and the next. New Orleans, 2023. The city had changed so much, yet Congo Square remained. As Jonathan walked its cracked pavement, he recalled 3 centuries gone by. He had seen empires rise and fall, wars won and lost, plagues and disasters. An endless cycle, just like his bargain with the Baron. Tonight the square was empty save for Jonathan. The dancers were long gone, dispersed over the years as beliefs had shifted, but not him. He was bound by blood and oath, and so had come. In his arms he held no stolen child, however. There could be no more sacrifices, he had seen to that. Instead, Jonathan carried a bundle of grave dust and chicken blood, bound with string and twine. His last desperate gambit to end this terrible cycle of death and renewed life. He entered the square and placed the false child upon the ground. Then, from memory, he began to beat out the ceremonial rhythm on a nearby wooden crate. The resulting echoes were faint yet carried through the darkness, reaching out across the veil. Calling the Baron forth one final time, the air grew deathly chill. Then, in an explosion of smoke and ash, Baron Samedi manifested. Behind him, the demon hog snarled with rancid breath. At the sight of Jonathan, it pawed the ground eagerly, hungry for the offering it was due. "My friend," rasped the Baron, approaching with outstretched arms. The gesture was almost welcoming despite his horrific visage. Behind the hollow sockets, his gaze turned quizzical. "No dancers to usher me forth." "The old ways fade," said Jonathan bitterly, "but our bargain holds for one last renewal." He indicated the bundle on the ground. With trepidation in his ancient heart, he watched the Baron approach it. This was Jonathan's final gambit. that by providing only false sacrifice, he could force the Baron to void their pact and finally let him rest. Baron Samedi reached down and grasped the bundle, then screamed. It was a shriek of rage and agony, echoing off decrepit buildings as he rounded on Jonathan. Behind the lower, the false child crumbled to dust, blown away on the night wind. "Trickery!" howled the Baron, stalking forward. "You dare betray our oath sworn in blood and death? Then now you shall face oblivion." He grasped at Jonathan with claws of bone, seeking his heart. Jonathan stumbled back, sprawling to the pavement as the Baron towered over him. Behind the lower, the hog sniffed curiously at the scattered remnants of dust and twine. "Yes, my old friend, oblivion," Jonathan cried as the Baron seized him by the collar. "For 300 years I have lived bound to you by youth and loss both stolen, but no more. Now we go into darkness together, unless you renew our pact again." Baron Samedi hesitated, skeletal face contorting in fury. They both knew the truth. Without sacrifice provided willingly, the ancient vow could not be completed. By denying him an offering, Jonathan had broken their cycle forevermore. Slowly the Baron released him. Above, thunder rumbled across the sky. Behind the lower, the hog collapsed in a pile of smouldering ash, no longer sustained by deathly energies. Then Baron Samedi threw back his head and laughed. It was a hollow, bitter sound, filled with madness and despair. His substance began to fray as he rapidly decayed before Jonathan's eyes, centuries catching up at last. "Well played, old friend," rasped the Baron. "But what awaits you now, save the grave you've evaded for so long?" Jonathan climbed slowly to his feet. As Baron Samedi before him crumbled like dust on the wind, he looked up to the sky and smiled. "Oblivion," he whispered in relief. Around him blew the ashes of his ancient oath, finally granted the ending he had so long craved. With a last sigh, Jonathan closed his eyes and collapsed lifeless to the cold earth. Above, the distant rumble of thunder faded slowly into silence. In the empty square, all was still once more.